Hello and welcome to this episode of FinTech Focus TV, brought to you by Harrington Starr, global leaders in financial technology recruitment. Head over to the Harrington Starr website today, where you'll be able to download our brand new documentary, The Era of Convergence, which charts the merger of traditional and decentralized finance. You'll also be able to see our new magazine, The Financial Technologist, with the top 1% Workplace Awards. Enjoy the show and we'll see you soon. Hello and welcome to another episode of FinTech Focus TV with me, Toby. Today I'm really excited to be back in the studio for the first time this year actually, and welcoming Simon Dewsbury. Simon, how are you?
Very good, thanks Toby.
Listen, great to have you in the studio today, and we met a couple of days ago. We were talking about your journey so far, and I immediately wanted to have you in here because I love, first and foremost, people who are passionate about what they're talking about. Alongside that, I also like people at the start of a journey. You finished institutionally recently.
That's right.
Kicked off on your own with Zannogen. Tell us a little bit first and foremost about your background, and then we'll get into a little bit more about what you're doing from there on as well.
Yeah, no worries at all. And professionally, it's a really interesting one. My kind of backstory is I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do coming out of university, as I think a lot of students end up in that position. Yeah. I was lucky to play a lot of rugby when I was at university, and Deloitte ended up sponsoring our rugby team. So by the time I finished my degree, I had sat through more than one or two careers presentations from those guys.
That's how they do it.
And I was like, well, do you know what? Being a management consultant, that sounds like a phenomenal idea. Like with hindsight, it is actually a really great way to start your career.
Yeah.
The exposure that you get to a number of very senior people very early on is phenomenal. And yeah, just kind of that exposure to the particularly the project delivery world, which is kind of where my journey started.
Yeah.
So did a few years with them, kind of as a general consultant. A lot of my background was in operational excellence type work, so lean process design, and a large part of that ended up being just by pure chance within the financial services space. From there, kind of made my way into the project and then program management space within investment banking. Ended up doing a big kind of 3-year cost reduction program with RBS.
Yeah.
By the time I left there, kind of moved over to the buy side to get some experience on the other side of the world. Gone through Rocos and Maven. In fact, it was Harrington Starr who placed me at Maven.
There you go.
A couple of years ago, and yeah, finished up with those guys back in October.
Yeah. And
decided that 15 years into my career, now was probably about the right time to set up on my own.
Well, I think we spoke about this beforehand as well, didn't we? That the very nature of your job as a consultant is to kind of make yourself redundant over that sort of that sort of period. I think it's a fascinating space that you're doing, and I love that sort of story. I think that, Deloitte and the consultancies are a great place to start a career, because it gives you that sort of that sort of understanding of creating value, of operational excellence, as you talked beforehand, but also exposure to a number of different things and a number of different people. I think it's where many a great career launches. The route that you've gone in has given you 15 years worth of insight into fascinating stories. I mean, we were sharing stories with some of the buy sides that you've worked with over the years, where there's a few stories definitely to tell. And I think it's a really interesting piece now to say, right, you could carry on. You have effectively a pathway that's very, very clear to stay institutionally and move through those sort of organisations. The thing I think that's exciting about what you're doing and where you're going is now where Zannogen can go, and how you can help more people and do more things and actually see where this can take. We spoke about a few of the consultancies that started, that I've worked with over many, many years. And it starts effectively with that idea and then can grow out significantly from there afterwards. So tell us a little bit from your view about where you see this and what you're doing and what you're trying to solve at the moment for your customers.
Yeah, exactly. So, value creation itself is something that at its core all businesses are required to do.
Yeah.
Right? It's ultimately the reason that businesses exist in the first place is to create shareholder value.
Yeah.
What exactly that means for an individual company or an individual person can vary quite a lot. If you go to the sort of traditional manufacturing spaces, value has a very specific definition. You add up the cost of all your raw materials, what it costs you to process it, labor, etc., and the value of some output that you get. You kind of subtract all those things and you get a dollar amount for the value that you have created along the way.
Yeah.
In financial services or in professional services, that kind of calculation isn't quite so straightforward.
Yeah.
Particularly in the trading space, right? You make one trade one day, you'll be like, oh, I created this much value. You make exactly the same trade the next day, but markets have moved against you, and suddenly you've done the same work and created negative value.
Yeah.
So that kind of definition becomes far more nuanced depending on the area that you work in, the markets that you work in, and there's also a very subjective kind of lens to it as well. When we talk about value, we generally refer to it from the point of view of the customer. So whether that is a customer of your organisation, or if you're working in a big institution, so like when I was at RBS, for example, working in a technology function, our customers were the traders, because it's the traders who were using the systems that we were building out.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, it's then, what is it that they derive value from? And actually, person A and person B will answer that question very differently. And so a lot of the challenge that you have as a kind of program manager, program director in that kind of space is not so much around the physical delivery of the program, it's more around consensus building. And how do we all get on the same page in terms of what it is that we're trying to achieve? And for me, that's the bit that I really enjoy. That's where I get my kicks. It's having those conversations with lots of different senior stakeholders and trying to put everyone in the right direction.
Do you know what? I've never really thought of it that in that sort of sense. It makes absolute. As soon as you say it, it makes perfect sense, right? Doesn't it? It's but you're talking about a lot of different people who will all be looking at the same thing and having different value drivers from it.
Absolutely.
So through every single different set of eyes, there is a different motivation for what happens within that sort of requirement, or that particular product, or that technology, or whatever it is that you're driving at that sort of stage. And I worked with a couple of people a while ago, who I think we spoke about it before on the agile side of things, and they talked a lot about winning hearts and minds. And in that program and project space, I think one of the core aspects of it all is to go out there and say, right, how do I win the hearts and minds of people I'm talking about? And I guess that comes first and foremost through really understanding what value genuinely is to each individual within that team, that business.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of big programs tend to fail because people start conflating the deliverables with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. A lot of the time a program is the Prince 2 stuff around this. A project is all about outputs, so a physical thing, a process, a system, whatever it might be. Whereas programs are a temporary vehicle designed to deliver a set of business outcomes. So this is more around what is the business capability that I'm going to get out of this. And actually the individual way that you go about delivering that, it doesn't matter if you change your mind on it during the course of the program, as long as you end up with that correct outcome at the end, then it's still been successful. And making sure that everyone's on the same page around what those are, making sure that there's alignment between what the program or project is trying to deliver and what the strategic objectives of the organisation are. These are the things that tend to either get distorted along the way, or people, 3 years into a big transformation journey, kind of either forget what it was they set out to achieve in the first place, or the business objectives entirely have shifted during that 3-year period and have moved on.
Well, the world changes. I mean, it's been changing at an incredible pace over the last few years, full stop. And I guess that, as when you look at long-term projects, that must have an impact into things. So the malleability has got to be an important part of it as well. Yeah,
absolutely. Right? And there has to be a lot of fluidity in the way that you manage a particularly large. If we talk about what I was doing at RBS, that was a kind of 3.5 year, £100 million cost reduction program. The cost of that was running kind of tens of millions of pounds a year. And that was very much kind of stripping cost out of the organisation. So, with that one, it's not too difficult to keep everyone on track because the objective is front and centre and very, very clear. But when you shift into more kind of the revenue growth side of things, there's multiple different ways in which you can grow an organisation. Where a market opportunity might be in early 2023, if it takes you 2 years to build a solution to it, that market opportunity may either not exist anymore, or your competitors built a solution within 1 year, so they've eaten the whole thing. So then, coming back to the way that it kind of affects your whole organisation, the agility that you need internally in order to kind of deliver that change, and also to change what you're doing on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis in response to kind of external market conditions becomes even more important.
And the identity, you talk there about multiple stakeholders and multiple, differing, I guess, for anything from individual things to macroeconomic things that can change the course of all of this sort of thing. What do you do to enable yourself and the teams to identify what those key, value creators are? You talk there about a very obvious thing of cost reduction. I was speaking to someone actually earlier on today about the sort of big 4 or 5 that I see all the time from software within trading technology, which is friction reduction, cost reduction, efficiency increasing, productivity increasing. But it seems that most things are around productivity, efficiency, or reduction. When you're dealing with, as you say, different people looking at the same problem from different lenses and different standpoints, etc., how do you go about identifying those and then in turn prioritising it? Because I imagine that text priorities are different from sales priorities, that are different from exec priorities at various different stages.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you can even kind of, from the 5 that you gave there, you can even kind of roll it back up one level. Pretty much anything that you're doing within an organisation needs to deliver one of 3 things: either revenue generation, cost reduction, or risk mitigation. If it's not doing one of those 3 things, you should probably be questioning yourself as to why you're doing it in the first place. Then the question around which of those is a priority for me is really a question for the organisation as a whole. And this is where it comes back to, what are my stated objectives as an organisation? If you are a macroeconomic fund, for example, who's got a stated objective to trade every single asset class, but you're not currently trading them all, then you could argue that there's some huge revenue generation potential out there that you're missing because you're not operating in those spaces. If you are a B2B SaaS organisation and you've
done that before as well, haven't you? I know you've spoken about bringing commodities in as asset classes.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of rollouts of new systems, whole asset classes, opening up offices in new geographies. And that's another great one, right? If you state that you want to be a global organisation, but you're currently only operating on 2 or 3 continents, well then there's an obvious scope to align your priorities over there. When it comes to then choosing which ones you want to do, one of the most common mistakes I see is an organisation that will tell you, we've got 10 number 1 priorities. It's like, quite clearly, whether you've got 10 or 0, you've got none, right? If you're claiming that you've got that many priorities, you just can't. There's no organisation that can be focused on that many things simultaneously. The number of projects that organisations tend to have in flight seems to be astronomical.
And it all comes from the best place, I guess, doesn't it, as well? Everyone wants to do, they want to improve the business, and there's all these different things, and it's saying, right, we need to do all of them.
And this is where, we come to the kind of the more softer side of the skill set, and actually working with founders, CEOs, executive committees, whoever it might be, and actually kind of having those difficult conversations and saying, this is what you've stated that you need to accomplish over the next quarter, over the next year, 3 to 5 years, whatever it might be, and say, of all of the things that we've got going on, we cannot physically deliver all of this. So which of these are the priority? And again, that will vary hugely across organisations. Even take 2 organisations that are operating in the same space, and they will choose different answers to that question, which comes back to the whole piece around value being relatively subjective in a lot of cases. It's what is important to you and your organisation.
And I imagine a number of the different companies you're talking to have got some fairly big characters that are involved in that decision-making process, and there are 10 sets of objectives, as you say, which is more than feasible within that. And some of them are competing within it, and everyone within those areas will be saying, mine's the biggest priority, or this is the biggest priority for me. How do you go about the politics, for want of a better expression, about saying this is where we need to go, and how does that take preference? Is it he who shouts the loudest, or is it something more scientific than that?
No, it's a great question. Look, particularly with newer companies or growth phase companies, they've come from a founder-led environment where the 1-2 handful of people at the top are the ones who make all of the decisions. Particularly as they start scaling and more outside capital starts coming into those businesses, you've then got more and more voices who want to have their say in how the company should be run. Particularly in the private equity space, you've then got the parent company who's coming in has either purchased it or is funding that growth, and they're going to have ideas on how something should work, how something should progress. If they happen to have a portfolio of a number of similar companies, then they're going to want to start designing them in such a way that they can get synergies out of them. Those may or may not be aligned with what the founder's objectives are and where kind of their vision for what their product, what their service needs to be. Ultimately, there is no silver bullet to this problem, right? Everyone needs to get around a table and have an adult conversation, and regardless of whether it's kind of designing your growth trajectory, figuring out what your portfolio of projects is going to be, all the way down to what individual developers are doing on a day-to-day basis. It's if people are making decisions kind of on their own or in isolation from the bigger picture, then everything's going to very quickly either fall apart, or you end up bloating an organisation because you've got kind of little pet projects running off in this direction here and that direction over there. So a lot of it just comes back to very clear and concise communication, understanding again what the objectives of the organisation are. How are those being measured? Ultimately, what you do today and where you need to be tomorrow. The only way of getting between those things are your projects and your programs and your change delivery. If you just keep doing what you're doing today, you're never going to get over there. You need to change something in order to get there. So how do you ensure that the projects that we're delivering on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in a year's time, in 2 years' time, are going to add up collectively to that step changing capability that we need to get where we want to go? And there's no way around that other than talking.
And that communication piece, I think, is so important. So we'll come on to that in a second. I think there's an interesting part of change, which is in an unglamorous sort of badge, which is all about operational efficiency. I think as soon as those sort of two words come out together, it's never going to be something there which sort of you have too many balloon drops over or what have you. But talk to me about operational improvements that can be made in organisations, large organisations or small, that allow that productivity to be made, or value to be driven, should I say?
I think organisations can scale from sort of 0 to 100 FTE relatively straightforwardly. The very new companies have a lot of manual processes, almost by definition, right? Because you're not going to go and buy the world's greatest HR system on day one. You're not going to go and buy this. Most small companies will run out of emails and Excel, right? And that's fine, it works, and it gets you to 10 FTE, it gets you to 20, it gets you to 50. And you can get up to about 100 by continuing to pump those manual processes, and ultimately you just load up your high performers with more and more work. You give them bigger and bigger roles, maybe you give them bigger job titles and bigger salaries to keep them happy, but ultimately it gets to a point where you can't just keep loading up those same few individuals. Something needs to change in order to scale the organisation. And most of that comes under this operational efficiency thing, right? Is how do I kind of review everything that is going on within my organisation, all of the day-to-day stuff. So how decisions are getting made, how information is flowing around the organisation. One of the biggest ones we see is around the use of data. We as a
I saw immediately where my head was going as we were chatting through there, because I think it's really underused as well, right?
Completely. We as a society generate so much data, and companies aren't any different. The question is it stored in a way that is useful? Is it structured in a useful way? Is it all in the same place? Chances are that bits of it are in a database over there, some of it's in an Excel spreadsheet over there, some of it's probably in that person's head over here. How do we join all of this together so that we're getting concise and useful information flowing front to back throughout the organisation? Data that sits in a database isn't any use to anyone. How do you facilitate getting it out of there? How do you distill it down into something that's more useful? And kind of that journey between data in a database and information in a set of reports that goes up to management is kind of where the operational inefficiencies kind of destroy value within an organisation.
I think there's a very interesting. I'm fascinated by data, full stop, which probably says a lot about me. But I think there's a piece there where it's incredibly underused in most industries. I've spoken about this a lot on the show in the past about where I think that the financial services sector's view of data lags way behind retail and e-commerce as a for example. And there's a lot of lessons that can come into to speed that up within this space. But alongside that, I think it's a utilisation of data, and that goes across most industries and in fact most sales teams, where I think people look at it and data can effectively be termed KPIs, right? And it's about, but for me, it's about how people can. You mentioned rugby at the start of it. I've always been interested in sports and data and such like, and how people are effectively using things to make the right runs at the right time to score the right try in that instance, or how they can shape and defend and look at performance metrics and physicality and all those different areas to improve people's performance. So what they're doing is capturing data, turning it into insight, and then making it into actionable results off the back of it. And I think what happens is there's lots of data that comes out of places, but it's the actionable insights piece that I think is lacking within it, 100%. And the ability to bring that to life, both in terms of data visualization and then a plan and a strategy that follows up from that data, so it's informed decision making, which is then effectively allowing people to run faster, hit harder, score more tries, or let in less. That's the same. It's the same analogy, isn't it? In terms
absolutely.
of how you take your business further forward.
Yeah, and look, a lot of what I was doing in my last 2 roles was around exactly this, actually giving visibility to senior management over what was going on a day-to-day basis within technology functions.
Yeah.
No one for a minute thinks that you've got 100 technologists sitting around twiddling their thumbs all day doing nothing.
Yeah.
We all know they're doing something.
Yeah.
It's just, what is it?
Yeah.
If you go and speak to the individual developers, or you go and speak to the development managers or the dev leads, of course they can tell you what it is. But how do we get that information in front of the decision makers at the top of the organisation without having to go and have 73 conversations every single week? Given the amount of technology that is used to facilitate a development process, we know what code is being checked in on a weekly basis. So we know who checked it in. So the data for what someone is working on is already sitting there. Yeah. It's lost in metadata over here and not sitting in a report over there.
Yeah.
So again, it's how can we use the technology that we've already got at our disposal in all of these organisations and start pulling out useful information from it. As you say, turning that into actionable insight.
The thing I think, going all the way back to where you first started your career and what you were talking about, management consultancy is effectively just bringing common sense to things from an external viewpoint, and allowing people to be like almost detached from the reality. When you're in something, it's very difficult sometimes to see that see what's very obvious when you come in over the top. And I love that, and I think it's why it's such a relevant industry to take things further forward. But what we touched on a moment ago, and I think is so important to all of this, is the importance of communication. So if I go back to when we first started really doing FinTech Focus TV on a sustained level, it was just during the pandemic, and I was speaking to lots of different people who were thriving professionally during that sort of period. So their businesses were, and we were trying to shine a light on that. There was a lot of doom and gloom around, and what we wanted to do is speak to people there who were winning and sharing those lessons from that. If I think back and you ask me about 2020 and 2021 and what companies who were really overperforming and outperforming the competition were doing and what they were getting right, particularly in terms of the functionality of their team, who were suddenly dispersed in ways that had never been done before, one word came back to me time and time again, and that was communication. And the best communicators were and the way they cascaded information through to their teams and over-communicated to their teams were generally the ones that were really thriving in that sort of scenario. I imagine when you're talking about value creation and driving, efficiencies and everything in between all of that, there's a huge part of it that comes into the art of communication. Yeah,
definitely. I had first-hand experience of this. I joined Maven right at the beginning of that first lockdown.
Yeah.
So I left Rockos in the January when we were all first locked down.
Yeah.
The first 3 months was phenomenal because I was on gardening leave, playing in the garden with the kids. It's like this whole lockdown thing's brilliant.
Yeah.
But then obviously starting a new role fully remotely, there's the challenges around that.
With the kids at the same time as well.
Whilst homeschooling the kids, it's a joy and a delight. The challenges that come around that in terms of just the length of time it took to onboard that institutional knowledge that you just absorb when you're sat in an office with lots of people.
Yeah.
The fact that you can't just drop into someone's desk and ask a quick question, you have to dial up a Zoom call or send a message, send an email, whatever it might be. I think it just pushed that communication piece to the forefront of everyone's minds.
Yeah.
As you say, the ones who got that right are the ones who really perform well.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see that continuing. Even now people are back in the office, is the people who've got into good habits around communication, around collaboration, is really going to start paying dividends.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other side of things that really was pushed to the forefront at that sort of time was tech and innovation. And these were businesses who were responding very quickly. I think before the pandemic, pivoting was seen as a sort of failure word. Very quickly afterwards, it was seen as a sort of survive and thrive word after it. Tell me where tech and innovation sits in this whole value creation drive.
It's right at the centre of it.
Yeah.
Industries that weren't tech focused have very, very quickly become hugely dependent on it.
Yeah.
I think if you go back kind of 10 years across a lot of organisations, everyone was trying to specialise in the one specific niche that it was that they looked after.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing now more of a shift to being able to join information, being able to join data across industries, across platforms. The fact that you've got a financial services focused recruitment company doing video podcast. Like, you just wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago, right? How do we drive eyeballs towards whatever our product might be? How do we gain insight from that? Equally, you know, you're going to see something. Deutsche were in the news recently. Their own FinTech lab has started rolling out an automated reconciliation process to a bunch of their corporate clients. So this is a piece of tech that they've developed in-house that they're now effectively giving away for free to all of their corporate clients, because they're seeing that the playing field on which we're competing has moved away from the raw product that it is that they're selling, in their case kind of banking services, towards how can I give extra value to my customers so that they end up being stickier customers, they stay around longer, they start talking about me more positively.
I think that's so important, isn't it? The digital world has driven the need for value in everything that everyone does. People aren't expecting just a service; they're expecting a service on steroids. And
Absolutely.
We spoke about friction reduction earlier on. How do I make it as easy as possible for people to work with me? And then you use the word sticky as well. How do people stay with me and you have that lifetime value? And to me, the companies that really sort of think about that, and I think. Many of the investment, the top tier investment banks have been very clever in this, and I think it will be. It was the same when fintech threatened to disrupt the industry. It was like, how can we bear hug it and build labs that allow these companies to thrive and almost incubate them within the business to allow those sort of things, those sort of wins to come through, which improves the service. I think it'll be the same thing with digital assets, where you start seeing massive institutional investment into the right sort of digital asset areas at the moment. And it's a similar sort of tale as old as time almost in terms of how people are doing it. And to me, when I think of efficiency, and we spoke before this about how when we were planning out what we wanted to talk about today, so much of it goes into the financial services world, but it also comes into what we're talking about. We spend a lot of time as a business talking about operational efficiency, operational excellence. We talk a lot about a business about how we can make sure we're as productive as possible. We talk a lot about how we can be as efficient as possible. And I think that's the sort of thing that you're doing, the journey you're going on at the moment, and what you can bring to a business, as you have done all the way through your career so far, is a really exciting thing to be looking at. So I could be talking about this for a long time, so I've got to be wary of the clock. I'm going to finish off, Simon, by talking or getting you to talk a little bit about who you're looking to help. So who are the people who should be reaching out to you and saying, look, I can help you at the moment out here in the marketplace, the sort of problems you're there to solve, and then finally, what's the best way of them getting in touch with you?
Wonderful. So as we kind of touched on, there's lots of different components to this. You've got the technology enablement piece, you've got the communication piece, you've got the kind of behavioural and cultural piece. It spans organisational design, project delivery, change delivery. All of these kind of individual components, historically might have been looked after by separate individuals in a large institution. My target market tends to be much smaller organisations these days, people who've grown quickly and either outgrown their current capabilities or are just looking for help in terms of kicking on, getting to that next step. Where I personally like to add value is by joining all of these different things together. I'm absolutely by no means the world's greatest project manager. I'm definitely not a technology expert. And when it comes to data and analytics, I can interrogate a database, but my SQL is average at best. But I can do a lot of these different things simultaneously whilst having conversations with senior stakeholders and bringing it all together. And that for me is kind of where my personal value proposition is.
Sounds fantastic. And so for people listening to that and saying, I need a bit of that in my life, what's the best way of them getting in touch with you?
Absolutely. Look me up on LinkedIn. My name's Simon Dewsbury, managing partner at Zannogen, or you can find us at www.zannogen.com.
Listen, Simon, I've loved that.
Cheers, Toby.
It's been a really good conversation. I told you it'd be the sort of things that I get myself interested in. And thank you all for watching. We will see you soon on another episode of FinTech Focus TV.